Well, hello, folks. Happy Sunday, everybody. Fellow Moparians, this video is for you. So, this video is basically to Hemi or not to Hemi. That's the question. So, I'd like to know what people's thoughts are when you're building a Mopar, classic Mopar, B-body, E-body, maybe even A-body. What are your preferences? And what did you decide to do? And why did you do it? So the two big thoughts on this video are 440 versus Hemi. Now, when I first built this car, I had grandeur thoughts and it was going to be a Hemi car. It had to be a Hemi car. To me, the ultimate Mopar was a 426 Hemi Charger. And it had to be a 650, 700 horsepower Hemi with a 4-speed or 5-speed. Well, as we went along with this restoration, for me, it finally got to where it started becoming a hangar queen. And when I started pricing the Hemis from Ray Barton or from for Hemis only, that was 18 years ago. They were in the $20,000 to $23,000 range. Well, as you know, life happens, and you've got a home and a family and things going on. Coming up with that kind of coin for your average guy, at least for me, started getting pretty expensive, and I had to start making some choices. Do I sit here and do I wait until I've got that kind of money, or do I eventually drive the car? So I had to make the decision. You know, that overdrive's pretty expensive, and a Hemi's pretty expensive. So I eventually made the decision, you know, I think I'm going to go the 440 way. So for me, it was, I had to finish the project eventually. So we built a 512, and it was, we went with a place called CompuFlow. Gentleman is unfortunately, he's deceased now. His name was Nick Wilson, and he ran a company called CompuFlow up in Ohio. And he set me up with the Max Wedge Indy heads, ported them, solid roller, and I couldn't be more happy with the engine. But this video, I'd like to know what people think and what your thoughts on building a Hemi. Now, the bucket list is I'd still want to build a Hemi. That's the only engine I've never built is a Chrysler Gen 2 Hemi. We've got a Gen 3 going on for the Barracuda, but a Gen 2 Hemi is pretty much the ultimate. However, what are the pros and the cons versus a Hemi versus a Wedge? Now, for me, it had to be for affordability, ended up being one of them. It was, hey, we got to get this thing moving. So when I built this engine, you know, I wanted a recipe for 650 horsepower, and I would say the way it drives, it's probably pretty darn close. Never been dynoed, no, I don't know. And so yeah, people say, well, you don't know what makes it. I don't. I really don't. I know it makes more power than it will go to the ground. I can tell you that. So hindsight being 2020 on the horsepower thing as well, for a street car, do you really need 650 horsepower? I kind of having second thoughts on that now. Do you really? I built other engines that I know were not anywhere near that range, and we're still extremely just about overpowered for a street car. But back to the Hemi versus Wedge. A Hemi is just a prettier engine. It's more awe-inspiring, and you know, you're going to get more looks at a car show. If that's what you're going for, is car shows and winning trophies. It's hard to beat a 426 Hemi. Now, let me tell you, I have driven a couple of Hemi cars, and they were more the factory 426 Hemi variety. They weren't strokers. They weren't big fuel injected. They were stock stroke engines. And there's two differences I've noticed basically on a Wedge versus a Hemi. And if you go back to the show Engine Masters did a really, really good comparison of a 446 pack with a 426 Hemi. And they used cam specs that were extremely similar. The compression ratios were almost identical. Everything about the engines that you could make an apples and apples comparison to, in my opinion anyway, was pretty close. They did a really good job. But what happened was on that video from Engine Masters with David Freiberger and Steve Dulcich and Steve Brule, the engines and the outcome were exactly what the Chrysler engineers said, basically how they marketed those two engines. The 446 pack was an absolute animal from, say, 2,500 all the way up to 5,500, close to 6,000. And where the torque came in, it dominated the Hemi. However, that Hemi, once it got up to about 3,000 RPM and then it hit its playground, I guess you could say, it took off from the Wedge. It was just, now these were stock iron heads on both engines. They both had, 906 castings that Dulcich did port, and then the Hemi, I think, had a little bit of work. I don't remember, but there was a big difference in how those two engines reacted. And when I drove our friend Johnny's 66 Hemi Belvedere 4-speed car, the seller, I went to go validate just look it over for mechanical integrity. And the seller was kind of said, hey man, just, put your foot in it. Go, you've never driven one, go ahead, go at it. And I don't like to beat on other people's cars. Things can go wrong, but I did go ahead and throw the wood at it a little bit. And it was totally different and exactly like that video went through that the Roadkill guys had. I would say from 2,500, or 2,000, it was okay. But once it did get up to about 3,200 RPM, that thing moved. And of course, it was a well sorted out Hemi. It had the stock manifolds and everything, but it was a well built factory style build, using the factory components. But whoever built it did a really good job. Yeah, it might have been a little bit bigger, but wow, that car lived up to its name. So my opinion for me is, although I love building engines and of course we do all muscle cars, I like driving them more than I like building them. And after a while, you got to be able to move forward with a project. So a Hemi these days, and I've kind of priced it out, to find a block, and I'm not even talking about finding a factory correct, say if I had to find a 69 Hemi block that was still serviceable, that didn't have windows in the side of it, you're going to pay out the nose for it. You're also going to pay out the nose for an aftermarket Hemi block. And if I was going to build a Hemi, I think I would want the one from, I think Bill Mitchell Products, or I forget who. There's a few different companies now that are, redoing the blocks. Brodix may have been one. I can't remember. But anywho, Keith Black was one of them. You can get another 426 Hemi block that's aftermarket. It's got a lot of improvements that have been done to it. So to me, that's a win right there. But you look at the price. I think Mopar Connection is building one now. The price of that block, I think that block is like $4,500 is for the iron version of it. Then you get into the heads. So everything on a Wedge versus a Hemi below the cylinder heads, I think is probably about the same as far as cost goes. Hemi may be a little more expensive on the pistons because you got the dome pistons. When you get up above those cylinder heads, or above the block, get into the cylinder heads, and especially the rocker gear, it's cha-ching, and it is a lot of money. I would say if I want to build another Hemi for this car, it's going to cost me an easy 25 grand to build a Hemi that's going to be, in this horsepower range. So, it's some folks, they want that, and I would love to have a Hemi. I really would. But if I had a Hemi and I was going to build a Hemi, I'm not going to tear this car apart just to go put a Hemi in it. My good friend Jamie from Dead Dodge Garage did a great video. He has a 68 Charger, and it's a 383 car. Looks great, and he did videos. It drives wonderful. It does everything it's supposed to do. And his thought was, man, do I really want to pull the 383 out that's doing everything that it's supposed to do and even has good power? Do I want to take that out and put the Hemi in it? The Hemi is obviously much more awe-inspiring. It's got all the oohs and the ahs. But is it worth it? because once you go down that road, you peel the engine out, you're gonna be spending tons of money. So looking back, hindsight 2020, I'm glad the decision that I made to go wedge. But I'm definitely not one to sit here and pretend that I don't have Hemi envy. So you guys out there with your Challengers, Cudas, Chargers, Roadrunners, Super Bs, whatever, Belvederes, I don't care, whatever it may be, what is your choice and why did you do it? And what were your thoughts, cost versus what it takes to do the Hemi versus the Wedge? And were you happy once you got that motor in there? Did that Hemi live up to what you wanted it to be? So again, to Hemi or not to Hemi, that is the question. I'm glad I did what I did because I've been driving this car for a while now, and I'm finally getting it dialed in with the overdrive and the EFI and soon to come vintage air, and it's been a lot of fun. So have a good day, everybody.